Pacific. Master and commander, right? Master and command. He heads for the Pacific, and he rounds Cape Horn. This is a saga for the ages. He goes into the Pacific. Next, you can see the little dotted line showing him sailing around the Pacific, goes to Valparaiso, and then a little more detail on the next map. You can see a little more detail, sails up the coast of South America, and goes, master and commander, to the Galapagos Islands. Next slide is the Galapagos Islands. Unbelievable. I mean, Patrick O'Brian had to know about David Porter. He often used real stories as the basis of what he wrote about. He destroys the British whaling fleet. He captures 13 whale ships, millions of dollars worth of property. But by this time, they've been at sea. Now let's just paint it where we are in the war. Okay, this is by December 1813. He's been, well, actually by the fall of 1813, he attacked the Galapagos Islands twice, had gone back to Ecuador. Now, in the summer of 1813, nobody knows where he is. In the United States, it takes a long time for information to get back. Summer of 1813, Shannon has defeated the Chesapeake. The American Navy is being blockaded in. The British are tightening the noose on the entire blockade, destroying American commerce. Things are looking bleak. We continue to launch invasions of Canada. For the most part, they fail. Our Navy now is not winning as many big battles as they were earlier. Things are not looking good. And suddenly, in the newspapers, in the fall of 1813, word comes. Our man Porter is in the Pacific. Same ship that was the first ship to go into the Indian Ocean is the first ship to go into the Pacific Ocean. He is in the Pacific. The newspapers talk about this as an action equivalent to a Magellan, Drake. He is our admiral of the South Seas. And he then creates this entire flotilla. And he sails from the Galapagos to the Marquesa Islands. This is an incredible story. He goes to the Marquesas because he needs to careen his ship. He needs to get organized. He has recruited many men from the British whalers. Some were Americans, some were British, not a problem. He's got a small little fleet of about 10, 12 ships. Next slide. And this is an illustration from Porter's own saga of his story. And you can see there at the Marquesas, he raises the American flag. He claims the Marquesas. And remember, the Marquesas is this island chain out in the middle of the Pacific. You could see that in the map. And I love this picture because it sort of shows all these different ships. He's got a fleet, but most of them are just like whalers and not very good warships. He does take one of the ships and makes it into a warship, calls it the Essex Junior, but it's not a very effective warship. And they're in the South Pacific, and it is exactly what you would imagine. See those bodies swimming in the ocean? Little pictures? Those are naked women. I'm imagining, right? Do I have to imagine? Oh, let us turn to the text, Porter. Virtue among them, the women, was unknown, and they attached no shame to a proceeding which they not only considered as natural, but as an innocent and harmless amusement. Lest we misunderstand him, right? Lest we misunderstand him. Porter wrote that with the common sailors and their girls, all was helter-skelter and promiscuous intercourse. Every girl, the wife of every man. He gets involved in some local wars, but ultimately he makes a decision. He gets his ship back in shape. Next slide. And he can sail anywhere, right? He can sail anywhere. But he is panting after glory. He is panting after honor. And he decides to sail the one place he knows the British will look for him. He goes to Valparaiso. So he sails to Valparaiso. He arrives in Valparaiso in early February. And in early February, 5 days after, 2 British ships. He sails to Valparaiso, I should say, with the Essex Junior, and 3 or 4 of his prizes, whale ships. So his crew is spread fairly thin. He goes to Valparaiso, and he's in there, and 5 days after he arrives, 2 British ships arrive, the Phoebe and the Cherub. Sometimes you wonder what the British were thinking, all right? Phoebe and Cherub. Oh, and the Peacock. Who names ships this way? But I've got to figure it out. The British Navy was so big, they were running out of names. That can only explain it. So the Phoebe and the Cherub are there, and they sail into the harbor, but they don't immediately attack Porter, because technically Valparaiso belongs to Spain, and technically Spain is neutral. And then there, to borrow a phrase from, I'll steal something from Patrick O'Brien, there on the far side of the world is enacted a verbal duel which gives meaning to the War of 1812. From the banner of the Essex is waving, right, or from the mast of the Essex is waving this banner: free trade and sailors' rights. And the sailors, okay, next slide. The sailors, the British Navy raises a banner in response. God and country, British sailors' best rights, traitors offend both. This phrase is aimed at every British sailor on the Essex. Remember, he had recruited sailors from those whalers. It is aimed at every one of those. It's saying to them, if you're traitors, what do we do with traitors? We hang them. If we capture you, you're dead. Right? Porter is never one to be outdone. So he raises his own banner. God, our country, and liberty. Tyrants offend them. This is the era where the memory of the French Revolution is quite, stark. He is saying, if tyrants offend liberty, they might be killed, just like the King of France. There's this little subtle subtext. He never explains why he raises that banner. This is my interpretation, I admit that. But it seems to me so clear when the language so parallels each other that it's a response, a direct response, one to the other. It doesn't, the sailors get into it. These American sailors, the British ships are anchored within earshot. And so every night the sailors serenade each other with their patriotic tunes. The Americans would sing like dozens of verses of Yankee Doodle, all of which are twisting the little needle into the side of the British. And the British, of course, respond with a whole bunch of songs. Then the American sailors send out a challenge. They say, send the Cherub away, and the Essex and the Phoebe will fight it out on their own. And they tell the British sailors, next line, that they were fighting in a cause that every brave and free man detests. And if you guys win, okay, great, you'll win, and then you'll go back to Great Britain, and you'll either be put into retirement at the old sailor's home, or they'll put you out on another ship, and then you'll face risks again. But if we win, we shall respect the rights of a sailor, hail you as a brethren whom we have liberated, and place you in future beyond the reach of a press gang. And they sign this. Sons of Liberty, saucy sailors of the Essex, who fight for free trade and sailors' rights. Well, next slide. The British respond. Your proffered liberty cannot avail, for virtue is the son of Albion's crest. Our God, our king, our country, our laws, we proudly reverence like Britons true. Your vile letter, which on board was brought, we scorn to answer, although they did, though with malice fraught. But if by such means you think to make dissensions rise, our loyalty to shake, know then we are Britons all, both stout and true. We love our king, our country, and our captain too. You know, we can look at this and we can say, oh yeah, well, obviously these British impressed sailors should be joining the Americans, but not all British sailors were impressed. Not all, and many British sailors felt a certain degree of loyalty to their king and their country. There's a certain ambiguity in the quarterdeck. And what these letters do, they're not only sending letters back and forth. I mean, because the British attempted to get the Americans to desert. And if you're a British sailor, you're kind of going, well, if I desert now, and the odds are, because the odds were in favor of the Phoebe and the Cherub, they had more men, more guns. The Phoebe had long guns, which could shoot from a greater distance. The Essex had mainly carronades, which were more powerful for short range. But the odds, I mean, there was over 100 men more aboard the Phoebe than the Essex. The odds were the British were going to win. If they desert now, one, they don't get hanged. Two, they'll get prize money, which is something that all sailors are always interested in. And three, they may get to live, you know, for another day. I mean, this is what's going on in their heads. So we can sort of write this off and we can say, oh, well, we're right and they're wrong. But there's an ambiguity in both cases. Next slide. Well, Porter wanted nothing more than to fight, and fight just the Phoebe. But the British weren't going for it. The captain of the Phoebe said, no, why should I risk everything on the chances of war? So finally, Porter decides to make a run for it. He all sail out, and Essex was a fast ship, and he heads out the port, out of the harbor. And the Phoebe and the Cherub follow him. And just as the Essex is passing a headway of land, a big gust of wind comes and blows off the top of his mid-mainmast. Now he can't outrun anything. He heads back into the harbor, but he cannot make Valparaiso harbor. He can't make it under the guns of the Spanish fort. He pulls into a hundred yards away from land. He's clearly in Spanish territorial waters. But Captain Gilje, the British captain, decides, enough's enough. We're going in for the kill. And he anchors the Phoebe across one end, the bow, and the Cherub across the stern, in range of his long guns, and he engages in one of the bloodiest battles of the War of 1812. So this is Porter's version of it. You can see how the mainmast has been destroyed. You can see how tough the little Essex is, although because you can see the holes in the sails of the British ships. But this is not a very good depiction of what happens. What happens is real disaster. Next slide. When word of this battle returns to the United States, American tars were described as fearless and patriotic spirit combating the tyrant of the seas. And there's stories, some very personal stories appear in the newspapers of a sailor being, having his leg blown off and saying, I can't be of any more use in the battle. Farewell, boys. I can be of no use to you. And he hopped out of the bow port. But the story, the case I like best is John Alverson. John Alverson, cannonball strikes him, his guts are torn out. And he says, never mind, shipmates, I die in defense of free trade and sailors' rights. and expired with the word rights quivering on his lips. I couldn't make this stuff up, right? This is what's reported in the newspapers. How true it is, we don't know, right? But I'm saying this is what people see. This is the ultimate battle